welcome back to Chapter 9 of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. In Chapter 8, the children realised that Edmond had probably betrayed them by sharing their plans with the White Witch. What prediction did you make for this chapter? Let's see if you were right. Chapter 9, In the Witch's House. And now, of course, you want to know what had happened to Edmond. He had eaten his share of the dinner, but he hadn't really enjoyed it because he was thinking all the time about the Turkish Delight. And there's nothing that spoils the taste of good ordinary food, like the memory of bad magic food. And he'd heard the conversation and hadn't enjoyed it much either, because he kept on thinking that the others were taking no notice of him and trying to give him the cold shoulder. They weren't, but he imagined it. And then he'd listened until Mr. Beaver told them about Aslan, until he'd heard the whole arrangement for meeting Aslan at the stone table. It was then that he began very quietly to edge himself under the curtain that hung over the door. For the mention of Aslan gave him a mysterious and horrible feeling, just as it gave the others a mysterious and lovely feeling. Just as Mr. Beaver had been repeating the rhyme about Adam's flesh and Adam's bone, Edmond had been very quietly turning the door handle, and just before Mr. Beaver had begun telling them that the White Witch wasn't really human at all, but half djinn and half a giantess, Edmond had got outside into the snow and cautiously closed the door behind him. You mustn't think that even now Edmond was quite so bad that he actually wanted his brother and sisters to be turned into stone. He did want Turkish Delight and to be a prince and later a king, and to pay Peter back for calling him a beast. As for what the witch would do to the others, he didn't want her to be particularly nice to them, certainly not to put them on the same level as himself, but he managed to believe, or pretend he believed, that she wouldn't do anything very bad to them. Because, he said to himself, all these people who say nasty things about her are her enemies, and probably half of it isn't true. She was jolly nice to me. Anyway, much nicer than they are. I expect she's the rightful queen, really. Anyway, she'll be better than that awful Aslan. At least that was the excuse he made in his own mind for what he was doing. It wasn't a very good excuse, however, for deep down inside him, he really knew that the White Witch was bad and cruel. The first thing he realised when he got outside and found the snow falling all around him was that he'd left his coat behind at the beaver's house, and of course there was no chance of going back to get it now. The next thing he realised was that daylight was almost gone, for it had been nearly 3 o'clock when they'd sat down to dinner, and winter days were short. He hadn't reckoned on this, but he had to make the best of it. So he turned up his collar and shuffled across the top of the dam. Luckily it wasn't so slippery since the snow had fallen to the far side of the river. It was pretty bad when he reached the far side. It was growing darker every minute, and what with that and the snowflakes swirling all around him, he could hardly see 3 feet ahead. And then too there was no road. He kept slipping into deep drifts of snow and skidding on frozen puddles and tripping over fallen tree trunks and sliding down steep banks and barking his shin against rocks till he was wet and cold and bruised all over. The silence and the loneliness were dreadful. In fact, I really think he might have given up the whole plan and gone back and owned up and made friends with the others if he hadn't happened to say to himself, when I'm king of Narnia, the first thing I'll do is to make some decent roads. And of course that set him off thinking about being a king and all the other things he would do, and this cheered him up a good deal. He'd just settled in his mind what sort of palace he would have, and how many cars, and all about his private cinema, and where the principal railways would run, and what laws he would make against beavers and dams, and was putting the finishing touches to some schemes for keeping Peter in his place, when the weather changed. First, the snow stopped. Then a wind sprang up and it became freezing cold. Finally the clouds rolled away and the moon came out. It was a full moon, and shining on all that snow, it made everything as bright as day. Only the shadows were rather confusing. He would never have found his way if the moon hadn't come out by the time he got to the other river. You remember he'd seen, when he'd first arrived at the beavers, a smaller river flowing into the greater one lower down. He now reached this and turned to follow it up. But the little valley down which it came was much steeper and rockier than the one he'd just left, and much overgrown with bushes, so he couldn't have managed it at all in the dark. Even as it was, he got wet through because he had to stoop under the branches, and great loads of snow came sliding off onto his back. And every time this happened, he thought more and more of how he hated Peter, just as if all this had been Peter's fault. But at last he came to a part where it was more level and the valley opened out. And there, on the other side of the river, quite close to him, he saw what must have been the White Witch's house. And the moon was shining brighter than ever. The house was really a small castle. It seemed to be all towers. Little towers with long pointed spires on them, sharp as needles. They looked like huge dunces' caps or sorceresses' caps. And they shone in the moonlight, and their long shadows looked strange on the snow. Edmond began to be frightened of the house, but it was too late to think of turning back now. He crossed the river on the ice and walked up to the house. There was nothing stirring, not the slightest sound anywhere. Even his own feet made no noise on the newly fallen snow. He walked on and on, past corner after corner of the house, and past turret after turret to find the front door. He had to go right around to the far side before he found it. It was a huge arch, but the great iron gates stood open. Edmond crept up to the arch and looked inside into the courtyard. There he saw a sight that nearly made his heart stop beating. Just inside the gate, with the moonlight shining on it, stood an enormous lion, crouched as if it were ready to spring. And Edmond stood in the shadow of the arch, afraid to go on and afraid to go back, with his knees knocking together. He stood there so long that his teeth would have been chattering with cold, even if they'd not been chattering with fright. How long this really lasted, I don't know, but it seemed to Edmond to last for hours. Then at last he began to wonder why the lion was standing so still, for it hadn't moved an inch since he'd first set eyes on it. Edmond now ventured a little nearer, still keeping in the shadow of the arch as much as he could. He now saw from the way the lion was standing that it couldn't have been looking at him at all. But supposing it turns its head, thought Edmond. In fact, it was staring at something else, namely a little dwarf who stood with his back to it about 4 feet away. Aha, thought Edmond, when it springs at the dwarf, it will be my chance to escape. But still the lion never moved, nor did the dwarf. And now at last Edmond remembered what the others had said about the White Witch turning people into stone. Perhaps this was only a stone lion. And as soon as he thought that, he noticed the lion's back and the top of its head were covered with snow. Of course it must only be a statue. No living animal would let itself get covered with snow. Then very slowly, and with his heart beating as if it would burst, Edmond ventured to go up to the lion. Even now he hardly dared touch it. But at last he put out his hand very quickly and did. It was cold stone. He had been frightened of a mere statue. The relief which Edmond felt was so great that in spite of the cold he suddenly got warm all over, right down to his toes. And at the same time there came into his head what seemed a perfectly lovely idea. Probably, he thought, this is the great lion Aslan that they were all talking about. She's caught him already and turned him into stone. So that's the end of all their fine ideas about him. Pooh! Who's afraid of Aslan? And he stood there gloating over the stone lion, and presently he did something very silly and childish. He took a stump of lead pencil out of his pocket and scribbled a moustache on the lion's upper lip, and then a pair of spectacles on its eyes. Then he said, "Yeah, silly old Aslan, how'd you like being a stone? You thought yourself mighty fine, didn't you?" But in spite of the scribbles on its face, the great stone beast still looked so terrible and sad and noble, staring up at the moonlight, that Edmond didn't really get any fun from jeering at it. He turned away and began to cross the courtyard. As he got to the middle of it, he saw there were dozens of statues all about, standing here and there, rather as the pieces stand on a chessboard when it's halfway through the game. There were stone satyrs and stone wolves, and bears and foxes and catamountains of stone. There were lovely stone shapes that looked like women, but were really the spirits of trees. There was the great shape of a centaur, and a winged horse, and a long, lithe creature that Edmond took to be a dragon. They all looked so strange standing there, perfectly lifelike, and also perfectly still in the bright, cold moonlight, that it was eerie work crossing the courtyard. Right in the very middle stood a huge shape like a man, but as tall as a tree, with a fierce face and a shaggy beard and a great club in his right hand. Even though he knew it was only a stone giant and not a live one, Edmond did not like going past it. He now saw there was a dim light showing from a doorway in the far side of the courtyard. He went to it. There was a flight of stone steps going up to an open door. Edmond went up to them. Across the threshold there lay a great wolf. It's all right, he kept saying to himself. It's only a stone wolf, it can't hurt me. And he raised his leg to step over it. Instantly the huge creature rose, with all the hair bristling along its back, opened a great red mouth, and said in a growling voice, "Who's there? Who's there? Stand still, stranger, and tell me who you are." If you please, sir," said Edmond, trembling so he could hardly speak. "My name's Edmond, and I'm the son of Adam, and Her Majesty met me in the wood the other day, and I've come to bring her the news that my brother and sisters are now in Narnia, quite close in the beaver's house. She wanted to see them." "I will tell Her Majesty," said the wolf. "Meanwhile, stand still on the threshold as you value your life." Then it vanished into the house. Edmund stood and waited, his fingers aching with cold and his heart pounding in his chest. And presently the great wolf Morgram, the chief of the witches' secret police, came bounding back and said, come in, fortunate favourite of the Queen, or else not so fortunate." And Edmund went in, taking great care not to tread on the wolf's paws. He found himself in a long, gloomy hall with many pillars, full, as the courtyard had been, of statues. The one nearest the door was a little fawn, with a very sad expression on its face, and Edmund couldn't help wondering if this might be Lucy's friend. The only light came from a single lamp, and close beside this sat the White Witch. I'm come, Your Majesty," said Edmund, rushing eagerly forward. "How dare you come alone?" said the witch in a terrible voice. "Did I not tell you to bring the others with you?" "Please, Your Majesty," said Edmund, I've done the best I can. I brought them quite close. They're in the little house on the top of the dam, just up the river, with Mr. and Mrs. Beaver." A slow, cruel smile came over the witch's face. "Is this all your news?" she asked. "No, Your Majesty," said Edmund, and proceeded to tell her all he'd heard before leaving the beaver's house. "What? Aslan?" cried the Queen. "Aslan? Is this true? If I find you have lied to me—" "Please, I'm only repeating what they said," stammered Edmund. But the Queen, who was no longer attending to him, clapped her hands. Instantly the same dwarf whom Edmund had seen before with her appeared. "Make ready our sledge," ordered the witch, "and use the harness. without bells. The end of chapter 9. Did you predict that we were going to switch the scene to Edmond? I didn't either. It felt a little bit like a film, didn't it, when you find out what's going on at the same time as a scene that you've just watched. In this chapter, we are following Edmond's journey to the White Witch. Did you notice that the White Witch is no longer referred to as the Queen, even by Edmond himself? Quite interesting, that. Now, how does Edmond justify betraying his siblings, his brother and his sisters? How does he justify it? How does he reason with himself that what he's doing is okay? Can you think of 2 or 3 reasons he gives himself why it's okay for him to be going and telling the White Witch of his siblings' plans? Well, he does say that maybe the White Witch isn't really evil because the people who are saying bad things about her are her enemies, and you would expect your enemies to say bad things about you. And also another reason is that she's been very nice to him, jolly nice to me, he says. He also feels that his siblings have been leaving him out and giving him the cold shoulder, so he's annoyed with them. And what else? He wants to be prince and one day a king. So with all these reasons, he feels justified in going and sharing with the White Witch. Despite the fact that Edmond is going to betray his siblings, the narrator tells us not to be too harsh on him. What evidence is there that Edmond is not wholly a bad character, a bad person? How could we justify Edmond's actions? Can you think of a couple of things? Well, first of all, he is bewitched, isn't he? He has eaten this magical Turkish delight, which seems to have such a pull over him that he's constantly distracted and thinking about it, even when there's real food in front of him, even when it's freezing outside, yet he keeps on going. He has been bewitched. So this is beyond his control. Why else should we not think that he is wholly a bad character? He manages to persuade himself that the witch isn't actually going to turn them to stone. He reasons with himself. He goes back and forth in his internal monologue, his internal thoughts. He doesn't really deliberately think that she's going to do something dreadful to them. He's also suffering, isn't he? He's cold. He's really uncomfortable. And he's frightened. We see his vulnerability. We see that he is just a child who's feeling disgruntled with his siblings, who's feeling ignored, who's been bewitched, who has dreams to be a prince. He does deface the statue of the lion. He scribbles on a moustache and spectacles, and he does gloat at first. But then how does he feel? He doesn't get any joy out of mocking the lion. He has this conflicting response, suggesting that he's not all bad. He also has an inner sense, deep down, that the White Witch is evil. So Edmond actually is quite a complicated character. He's quite a nuanced character, and these ideas suggest that he isn't wholly bad. Edmond is becoming increasingly frightened as he's nearing the witch's castle. How is the description of the witch's castle foreshadowing of the danger that Edmond feels he may be approaching? How is the house described? It's got loads of these turrets, and they're as sharp as needles, like a dunce's cap or like a sorceress's hat, like a sorceress, a witch's cap or a wizard. A magic hat, something that has something quite frightening about it. And these shadows on the snow are eerie, a little bit disconcerting and scary. And then as he goes into the castle, he sees these statues, which suggest that actually the things that are being said about the witch are true. What's the effect of the lion being made of stone in this chapter? How does it create a sense of tension and shock in the chapter as the chapter unfolds. He's very frightened at first, isn't he, Edmond? But then he realises that the statue isn't real, and he becomes a little bit more confident and less cautious. Even though he is cautious about passing this enormous giant, he's more relaxed because he knows they're made of stone, and then he meets the wolf. Now, what is the effect of Edmond thinking that all these animals and creatures are actually made of stone? Exactly. He gets the shock of his life when the wolf springs alive with its great jaws and growling voice, because he had been lulled into this false sense of security. It's quite an interesting sort of opposite, isn't it? He first of all gets frightened by something that's made of stone and then is not frightened of something that's real, thinking that it's made of stone. It's quite a good way of shocking the reader as well. Were you quite shocked by that? Have you come across the word gloating before? When Edmond sees the stone lion and thinks it's Aslan, the narrator says he stood there gloating over the stone lion. Now, he says, Edmond, he thought, this is the great lion Aslan that they were talking about. She's caught him and turned him into stone. So what's happened to Aslan is that this great threat, this great liberator, has been captured and his power's been taken away. So Edmond, in gloating, is feeling good about something bad that has happened to the lion. And that's what gloating means. It's enjoying somebody else's misfortune and being happy with yourself. Do you actually think that this lion is Aslan? Let's look at the description of it. It looked so terrible and sad and noble, staring up at the moonlight. It is this incredible creature, terrible meaning inspiring terror, so still looks powerful. Could this be Aslan? What do you think? You know what to do. Make your prediction. Is this lion Aslan? What is the White Witch going to do next? Are we going to continue with Edmond's scene? Or are we going to switch back to the other children? What do you think? Make your prediction. Grab something alive or stuffed. Speak your ideas aloud. Come up with reasons why. Is there information in the text? What other ideas do you have to support your thinking? Until next time.